welcome to Mental Health Matters. My name is Barbara Myers, and I'm the host of the show. On today's show, we're going to be discussing spirituality and mental health. And I'm very happy to have as our guest Dr. David Lukoff, who's one of the foremost experts on spirituality and mental health. He's a licensed clinical psychologist and has been for 25 years. He works with clients who have serious mental illness. He is a mental health client himself. Currently, he's a professor of psychology at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology in Palo Alto. He's the author of 70 articles and chapters in various books on spirituality issues and mental health. He's the co-president of that Institute of Spirituality and Psychology and the Association for Transpersonal Psychology. And he maintains a web-based spiritual competency resource center with online classes on spirituality and mental health, which I can say that I have taken and I can testify they're very good. So welcome, David. We're very happy to have you here.
It's delightful to be here and to be helping out with the good work that you're doing in this field.
Oh, thank you. Today we hope to give information about spirituality and mental illness and to reassure people who have had spiritual experiences when in a psychotic state that these can be potentially enriching experiences, and to tell people about the importance of religious community for mental health. So we'll do that by telling our own stories. I'll start by telling mine. I was first hospitalized for depression shortly after the birth of my daughter, now nearly 30 years old, so that's how long ago it was. I was in the psychiatric ward of our local hospital, and I was not happy at all about being there or being around those kind of people. And even though I was successful with medication and so forth, getting back to my job, I was very deeply unhappy with the experience and basically unhappy with myself having gone through that experience. This went on for many years, and eventually, 8 years later, I finally told myself that I am not going to live my life like this anymore, and I started seeing my psychiatrist more frequently to try to get at the bottom of whatever it was that was bothering me, and I told him I was willing to make whatever changes in my life that needed to be made. And so we started having fairly frequent sessions, and I did all of the things that he assignments that he gave me, some which were difficult to do. And I remember going to see him about 2 or 3 months after we started this, and walking in and saying, I don't know where it came from, but I'm happy. And I'll never forget what he said. He said, it came from you, pointing at me. And that was the first time that I ever had any notion that something important was inside, something that gives me happiness, something that even has divine promise, some feeling of spiritual center. And I hadn't been to church for at least 20 years, and this was just a really new revelation for me. I became happier and happier and happier, and the culmination was a meeting at which at my job we were trying to convince the vice president of our company to fund one of the projects that we were proposing. And as our management was giving a presentation to the vice president, I was sitting in the back of the room, and the vice president's secretary came in the room and handed him a message. And as she reached out and handed the message, I saw a halo around her head like this. And I knew that I was the only one seeing it and that other people weren't. And the first thing that came into my mind was, God is trying to tell me something. I haven't been to church in 20 years, but God is trying to tell me something important. And I looked around the room, and there were several other of the quote-unquote least significant folks in the room that had halos around their head. And I was, really excited about the ideas. I didn't talk to anybody about them because I didn't understand it very much myself, but I recognized it as being a spiritual experience. Mm-hmm. Then I felt like, well, maybe it means I'm cured and I don't have to take my medication anymore and I can just never have to bother with this mental health stuff anymore. I stopped taking my medication, told my doctor I didn't have to see him anymore, and went on my way, and within 3 weeks I was back in the hospital. This time I was psychotic. And the nature of my psychosis is that I thought I was dead. And I know this does not sound logical to anybody that's listening, but that in fact is what I was thinking. Mm-hmm. And I thought that I was in heaven and that all of the other psychiatric patients and me were waiting to be reborn. And this time it was a very different experience than my first time. All of these other people that I saw were my friends. They were all God's children, and all God's children like me. And it was with that recognition that I also was one of God's children, which was life-changing for me. And I eventually got back on medication, which keeps me stable. But in one sense, the death stories make sense in that an old part of myself, a part of my seeing myself as somebody that was a defective human being, was dead, and what was being reborn is a more spiritual way of looking at the world. And I eventually, over a period of years, I got involved with a church and then eventually decided to become a minister. So the whole thing was very life-changing for me and has informed my life from then on. So you can see that I'm a believer in the fact that spirituality can be an important part of helping someone's mental health and in helping their lives. So that's my story.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So,
very moving story. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, my experience was what would be classified as a psychotic episode, but it was also my spiritual awakening, and it was also what led me into the field of psychology. So let me say a little bit about that. I was 23 at the time, and I had been a graduate student in anthropology and had gotten my master's degree and went through a kind of crisis about who I was and what I wanted to do with my life, and I was very unsure about whether I wanted to stay in school, and I decided to drop out and started hitchhiking around the United States. And this was 1971. But culturally, it was still what we talk about as the 60s, and so, hitching around the country was something a lot of people were doing, and I ended up in San Francisco and just was finding places to stay and checking out the Bay Area and so on. And while I was staying at somebody's house, I woke up in the middle of the night and just walked into the bathroom, and all of a sudden looked in the mirror and noticed that my right hand, I was holding it in this position, and it was giving off a white light. And I looked in the mirror, and I had a sudden flash of insight that the glowing hand meant that I was a reincarnation of Buddha. And then right after that, it came into my mind that I was a reincarnation of Jesus Christ, and that I had a mission to write a holy book that was going to unite all the peoples of the world. And I actually started right then and there in the middle of the morning. I pulled out my journal that I was keeping notes in and started to write. I was having conversations in my mind with Buddha and Christ, but also with people like Locke and Rousseau, who wrote about how you form a social contract and create a new society. And I was reading Freud and reading Jung. I'm talking with Freud and reading and talking with Jung in my mind. And I was also having conversations with the anthropologist Margaret Mead, and also had conversations with people like Bob Dylan and Cat Stevens, and they were all helping me to write this book so that it could be a popular book that would be read and that would be the foundation for this new religion. And I spent about 5 days during which I slept very little, an hour here, an hour there. And when I finished writing it, I Xeroxed about 40 copies. I mailed off a bunch of them to friends and family all over the United States, and actually went to Berkeley and stood there on Telegraph Avenue and handed out copies of this to people. And at that point, I thought I had done all I needed to do, and these books would now start circulating around the world. In my mind, at the time, Berkeley was kind of the new Jerusalem. It was the new center of the world. And so by distributing the books there, they would make their way around the world, and then at some point I would be recognized as this new prophet. So, at that point, I was pretty out there, and it was one of those experiences that could have gone either way, I think. I consider myself very lucky that I, in fact, did not get hospitalized. I had a number of very good friends who allowed me to stay with them, fed me. I had no money. I think if I had ended up in the streets with no money, I could have very well ended up in a hospital, but I didn't. And I spent about 2 months in that state of mind. And now I know that there is some research that people having first psychotic breaks, there's a fair percentage of them, nobody pinned down exactly what the percentage is because the research is very hard to do, but 75% of people would be able to go through these kinds of experiences on their own. But I was lucky in that I was allowed to do that. I was allowed to take this entire, inner journey all the way through to the end, to the point where I no longer believed these things. At which point I was left with this question, like, what the hell just happened?
Right.
How did this Jewish boy who was raised in a fairly agnostic household, we were not members of the Jewish temple, I never learned Hebrew or Jewish prayers or things like that, and I had never taken courses on religion in college or graduate school. How did I come to think of myself as Buddha and Christ? I mean, basically two people about whom I knew almost nothing. So I actually started to do a lot of reading about Buddha and Christ, not only just who they were, but also what they are psychologically. So, for example, Jung views Christ as an archetype of the ideal self. So I started to read Joseph Campbell and a number of other people to try to help organize and figure out what happened to me. I also went into therapy. I saw a Jungian analyst for about 5 years to help me piece this together and make sense out of it. And it's ultimately what led me into psychology, but it's also what led me on my spiritual path. So I started to explore things like meditation. I took workshops with Zen masters and lamas. I also took workshops with Native American medicine men like Wallace Black Elk and South American shamans like Matsua. And they all were parts of the puzzle of what I had gone through. Then, once I did decide to go into psychology, I ended up doing an internship at Camarillo State Hospital, and that's in Southern California, although it's no longer a hospital. But there I started to meet people who had very similar experiences to my own, and it really raised the question in my mind about why are they there in the hospital and why am I here in this role as their psychologist. So I really started to look more at these kinds of experiences from the perspective of how, as a psychologist, I can help people move through these experiences to a healthy resolution. So my first work in the field was about how to identify people having these kinds of spiritual emergencies and how they can be allowed to go through them without medication and without hospitalization. More recently, over the past 15 years, my work has been working with consumers, people who have various kinds of mental disorders, who also have these kinds of experiences, but whose experiences have been ignored. And so my work over the last 15 years has been with the recovery movement in trying to bring a spiritual component into recovery. So it was all based on that experience that set me off on my career and on my spiritual path.
Oh, that's a wonderful story. Thank you. In your online classes, you emphasize that many recent researchers have found a positive correlation between religiosity and good mental health. Can you tell us about this research?
Well, there are almost 2,000 studies right now that basically show that what psychology and psychiatry have assumed to be a negative influence of religion, that it contributes to neurosis and psychosis, and that it's a way for people to avoid their problems. In fact, it's actually the research has clearly demonstrated that, in fact, religion and spirituality are resources for people, that they help people with both mental and physical illnesses. And
it's certainly been a resource for me in my work and my overcoming my hospitalization. To have that religious community there has been tremendously helpful to me.
Yes,
yeah.
And the research confirms that it's not only helpful with people who have illnesses to help them cope with it. In fact, there's a whole literature and many books on what is now called religious coping. So if you Google that term, you would find quite a few articles. It's also preventative. That is, people who are involved with religion and spirituality are also less likely to get both physical and mental illnesses.
Has the research ever identified anything, aspect of religion which might not be quite so helpful?
There are some specific religious beliefs which tend to be associated with a poorer outcome. For example, about a quarter of all people with serious mental illnesses as well as serious physical illnesses, about a quarter of them believe that their illness is a punishment for having sinned in some way. And that particular belief is actually associated in very good quality research with a negative outcome. Another religious belief that is associated with a negative outcome is the belief that a person doesn't have to do anything about their illness. They're just going to turn it all over to God or a divine, like, higher power, but they don't have to do anything to change in their life. That's also associated with a negative outcome. But there are many functional religious beliefs, like believing that God will help you if you help yourself, believing that God would not give you more than you can handle. So there's a number of religious beliefs which are associated with a positive or preventative outcome.
Right. Tell us about the new DSM-4 diagnostic category of religious or spiritual problems, which I know you were one of the writers of. What kind of symptoms would lead to a person being diagnosed with this problem?
Well, initially when I started to work with Dr. Francis Liu and Dr. Robert Turner, two psychiatrists, on this on a proposal for this new diagnostic category, this was back in like 1990, we were really focused on spiritual emergencies. people who had experiences kind of like mine, who were getting hospitalized and put on medications they didn't need. That's how we started. But as we started to review the research to make our proposal, we realized that there's actually quite a wide range of religious and spiritual problems. So, for example, we realized that there's experiences like a loss of faith. A person who has had a devout belief in, say, Catholicism, but who goes through an experience maybe of illness or something and believes that God was not there for them, and then loses their faith, no longer goes to church and services, loses the social support of that church, loses their faith. That's another example of a religious or spiritual problem. Having a near-death experience where a person leaves their body, ascends maybe through a tunnel, sees white light, maybe even talks with angels or dead relatives. That's another kind of experience. When a person returns from that kind of experience, they can have a lot of questions. They can be very concerned about, was that a crazy experience? Their relatives and peers can also have that exact kind of question if they talk about that experience. So that's another example of a kind of religious or spiritual problem. So we collected the literature on about 10 of these kinds of religious and spiritual problems. A very intense mystical experience can also lead a person to question a lot of their values and maybe question the way they've been living their life. So we put together this literature review documenting how many people bring religious and spiritual issues into therapy, into treatment. We also documented surveys of psychiatrists and psychologists showing that they are provided no training in how to deal with religious and spiritual issues when people bring them up. And we also were able to show that this is a very common thing that people bring into therapy. So by summarizing all this research in articles that we published and presented to the American Psychiatric Association when they were preparing the DSM-4, we were able to convince them over a period of about 4 years that there was a need for this new diagnostic category, and it was accepted in 1994 into the DSM-4.
Do you know how often it's been used?
It is used in certain settings fairly frequently. Interestingly, the U.S. military uses this very frequently because they know people in difficult situations like combat come back not always with a mental disorder, but with really a profound questioning. Maybe they've seen their friends killed. Maybe they themselves had killed people who then children or women who then they realized probably were not combatants, and then they're left with a lot of really deep soul questions. Psychiatrists and psychologists also use this in private practice when people bring issues into treatment that are not mental disorders, but as a psychologist, I'm expected to make a diagnosis, so I can make a diagnosis of religious or spiritual problem without saying the person has a mental disorder. So private practice people use it. It's not used very often in hospitals. I've used it when I worked at the VA because I would find myself working with patients both who had mental disorders, substance abuse problems, and also health problems. Who I would also work on the spiritual dimension of their problem, and so then I would actually assign an additional diagnosis in their chart of religious or spiritual problem. And right now, one of the things that I do is give workshops on this at the American Psychological Association. I've given workshops at the American Psychiatric Association, and I've published on it. So my expectation is that the number of people using this will continue to increase.
What do you think distinguishes someone who has a psychotic illness like schizophrenia from a person who's having a religious awakening or religious experience? Is there a way to distinguish those two?
It is a topic that I have looked at in some depth, and I do think, and I've written about ways to identify people who are going through the kind of spiritual emergency that I went through. And briefly, one of the things for a mental health professional to look for is what the experience looks like. Does it have the appearance? Is the person talking about religion and spirituality using descriptions that look like a near-death experience or a mystical experience or something that we know in the literature includes a lot of religiosity. The second thing that a mental health professional can use are good prognostic signs. What we know is that people who were, for example, holding a job, able to complete school, had a boyfriend or a girlfriend, all of those kinds of things are signs that a person is likely to bounce back from that kind of an episode. Also, if they have a sense of curiosity about what they're experiencing, that sense of, wow, what's going on with me? I'm experiencing all these new things, and a desire to explore them. That's also a good outcome sign. So that's probably a couple of easy things, and I've written articles about some additional kinds of things that a mental health professional can look for.
I have some resources that I'd like to recommend. First, there's Dr. Lukoff's website, in which he has the Spiritual Competency Center. Is that right?
That's right.
And he has a number of different classes that you can take,
which are all free. They're all up online for free.
Then there's also a book that I have written, a curriculum to teach congregations how to be more intentionally supportive and helpful to people with mental disorders. I'd like to thank our guest, David Lukoff, for being with us. It's been quite an interesting discussion.
It's been a pleasure.
And I'd like to close with these words. Take courage, friends. The way is often hard, the path is never clear, and the stakes are very high. Take courage, for deep down there is another truth. You are not alone. Thank you for watching.